that was a really wonderful passage that we have just read.
Yeah.
Welcome to week 3 of our 2024 Lent course, Jesus and Calling on the Road to Easter. I'm Philippa.
And I'm Matthew. I come up from, I'm from the East Molesey area. Where are you from?
I'm based here in Godalming, Minster. So last week, Gemma and Neil shared some of their insights around Jesus' calling in John 2, as well as some of their own stories and experiences of being called by Jesus.
And so Philip and I are going to try and continue that story, continue that journey by sharing some of our own experiences and reflections by looking at this next chapter in John 3. We hope that it will be helpful in your own discernment and calling as you wrestle with what God is calling you to do in your life.
So I was going to start by asking you, Matthew, what really struck you about this passage?
And I think the thing that obviously leaps out is that famous passage, John 3:16. I guess the thing that leaps out at me, this is such a huge vision, a sort of expansive framing of God's mission to the world. And I know that sometimes I have a tendency to squeeze it into a sort of envelope size. And here Jesus is sort of broadening his mission to the renewal of everything, the whole world. And of course also highlighting his central role in it, but also that the play on darkness and light really grabbed me in the second half. And the idea that I think it was the people love darkness. Why would they love darkness? But then also the counterpoint to that, but whoever lives by the truth, and by that I understand by Jesus is the living truth, comes into the light so that it may be seen plainly that what they have done has been done in the sight of God. And I find myself wondering, am I doing that? Am I actually living in that place where I am shining a light to all these people who are in the darkness? How about you? What struck you?
Well, you just mentioning that, one of the things I was reading about this passage talked about it's full of contrasts, and it does talk about the light and the dark, but actually real life is rarely, sometimes, but rarely like that. There's more of a graduation between the light and the dark.
Yeah.
So it's interesting you saying, am I living in the light? We all have that fear or concern that we are somewhere in the shadows. We're not quite fully in the light. And I think that's what that passage is saying to me as well, that there are graduations within things. It's okay to not always be sure. It's okay always to be exploring and inquiring, but reminding yourself, as you just said, of the enormity of God's mission. I was going to just say about your bit about that so much as well, because we were chatting before, weren't we? That this had never struck me before, but I was reading something that was suggesting that the way that we interpret that God so loved the world, I've always thought of that as he loved us so intensely, so enormously. And of course that's right, and that's a very valid interpretation. But there's also something in the original wording that's about, it's the way in which he loved. You could translate so as thusly, in this way.
Really?
So God loved us in this way. He gave his only son. So it is a measure of the intensity of the love, but it's also God loved the world by doing this. This is what he then did. So it's about his response to that love that he's feeling, not just, I love you so much.
We're trying to think a little bit about how people are actually called, how they find their vocation. Who was really being called here, do you think?
Because when you just read the passage itself, it's not clear who this is being directed to. Just prior to this, Jesus had been talking with Nicodemus, who was doing his inquiring and asking and questing. So although we have structured the chapters such that we don't see this as a whole piece, this is perhaps directed at Nicodemus, who is asking, who is trying to find out what this is all about.
And it must have been quite a dramatic statement, because this is the sort of broadening for Nicodemus from maybe a very narrow understanding. And suddenly there is this whole world all-encompassing. I wonder what he made of it. What happened to him next?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because he does pop up again. He pops up quite near the end of the gospel, where he was sort of arguing with the Pharisees that Jesus is at least given a fair trial. And then, of course, he's at the foot of the cross helping to take down Jesus's body and prepare it for burial. So it looks as if this questing, inquiring person who maybe got an answer he didn't quite fully understand, went away and did a bit of thinking.
So this whole idea of the framing of mission of God as redeeming, renewing all things, and so the whole world. I think I used to have quite a narrow understanding, I think, earlier in my faith journey, that actually my calling as a follower of Jesus was mostly about getting people to believe in Jesus.
What we call sort of straightforward evangelism.
Exactly,
yes,
straightforward evangelism, and then they're saved, and then I should
Job
move on
done.
to the next person and just keep going. But this seems to be a bigger vision or something broader than that.
I think that's absolutely right. This is about a relationship, isn't it? That Nicodemus is wanting to find out more, and he's coming to someone he loves and trusts and asking questions.
Yeah.
And even when he doesn't truly understand the answers, he's keen to keep persevering and find out more. And yes, Nicodemus doesn't go off and decide that he's going to become a member of the temple priesthood. He seems to come and do some very practical, loving things. His calling, at least as far as we can tell, seems to be quite hands-on.
I worked at Tear Fund for a little while earlier in my career, and so we had these amazing theologians who were always very helpfully trying to frame everything we were doing at Tear Fund to help the poorest in the world, but try to think about how we did that in a way that was framed by, and Chris Wright especially went on and on about this, by the mission of God. And by this work where God's redemptive work in his creation to renew and redeem and restore all things to himself. And this was really important because it led us to a way of thinking about all of our work. And we had this very helpful framework that he introduced, which was God's mission of renewing all things, is about restoring relationships. Going back to your point on relationships, it's all about restoring relationships between me and God, between me and myself, my own self-understanding, between me and you and my neighbours all around the world, but also between me and all of creation, the environment, the world, the natural world as well. And so my calling is to participate in God's mission of renewing all things, individually with God, with ourselves, with our neighbour, and with all of creation. I find that really got me thinking, okay, if this is what I'm doing at Tear Fund, how are we participating in that mission, this huge mission that is at the heart of John 3:16?
Because it can be quite easy to think of calling in the sense of what is God calling me to do. To be, well, do I go off and seek ordination? Or do I go and do a lay ministry course? Or do I sign up on a rota for being a welcomer? Yes, absolutely. But that's actually really quite a narrow view of what God's calling is. If our life is in God's hand, then our whole life is part of God's calling, isn't it?
I think I used to think the only people who God called to do anything in terms of hearing or really discerning a calling or a vocation was pastors of churches and missionaries in far-flung countries. But I went on this amazing course that really completely blew that idea to pieces, just as you've said, that actually we're all called. God calls, if only we give enough time to listen and hear his voice speaking to us. But how about you?
I'm a teacher.
So do you feel called to teaching?
Well, it has been part, using that J word, of my journey, because I did go and do the LLM course.
So what's the LLM course?
So being a lay minister within this church here, and really enjoyed that, getting involved in leading some services and preaching and doing all those kind of things, and sort of thought, great, well, maybe I just sit in this for a bit. But I am a qualified teacher and I had been teaching but part-time, and then this opportunity to go back to full-time, working in a year group I love being in with reception, 4-year-olds. Not everybody's cup of tea, but I really enjoy it. And so I went for it to see how that would feel, and I am loving it. And this is being very honest, but there are moments in the classroom when something will happen, a child will just sort of get something, enjoy something or see something. And it more or less moves me to not sobbing, but to just quiet tears. I just know that I'm doing the right thing in the right place at the right time. And it's that sense of I'm lucky to be able to do what I feel I'm being called to do. And having done lots of other things in my life, coming to do this right now feels right. But it may not always. It may be that there are other things that I will be called into doing. But at the moment, it just feels good.
One of the things that sort of bothered me for quite a long time was the idea that actually, if I'm going to be a teacher or work as a nurse in a hospital or in local government or an investment banker or whatever the thing is you feel called to, how do we discern that? How do you figure out where that sense of vocational calling might be, apart from going on a course?
I think it's a really difficult thing. It's wonderful if you feel that you do know.
Got it. Yeah.
I feel for those who don't
struggle.
know, because I do appreciate that's a problem. It is about that listening and being open, and it is about perhaps trying something and just seeing whether that feels right. Because I think you do know when you're in the midst of something.
You sense it. So when you're in as a teacher, how does your faith express itself there? Is there a way that teaching feels like your missional front line?
I think it does for me, because as you say, I think that is what I am, you hesitate to say gifted to do, but I love teaching. And I love nurturing those children and giving them the kind of experiences that they will really treasure and a way into learning that they will take through their lives with them. And of course, it's not just about the children, it's about their families, and it's about the colleagues that you're working with.
Yes.
And actually, you're really blessed to be in any workplace where you can build those relationships. But it's most certainly not about walking in on Monday morning and saying, hey, the sermon that I heard on Sunday was about this passage, and I'd like to talk about the theology behind that. It's much more embedded than that. It's a driver for how you behave with other people.
When we think of evangelism, we often end up thinking sort of preach the gospel or hand out a sort of tract or something. Yes, of course, there are sometimes opportunities to talk about the way of Jesus, the kinds of things he did. Going back to the earlier passage, I can be light by trying to do some of those things, or maybe talking about those things, or explaining the way maybe a biblical story illustrates something that is important.
For me personally, and this is just me personally, it's about not hiding your faith.
Not hiding your faith.
So that when it becomes a natural part of what's...
The conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I guess, starting to sort of drop in, because I happen still to be doing preaching or leading a service, I might mention I've got to go and write a sermon, but just as a part of a conversation rather than pushing a message at anyone.
This whole question about vocation, I think the thing that really strikes me is that when we really find that God-given sense of this is what I'm called to do, this is what God's asking me to do, this is the way he's made me to do something beautiful and participate in his mission of renewing and redeeming all things. When we find that place and we're doing it, with that in mind, we're almost God's agent here. We're God's secret agent. It sounds a bit naff, but you know what I mean. God has asked us to do this as part of his mission to renew and redeem all things. I think we approach the job in a very different way. It also means because we're doing it, hopefully with some passion, hopefully with a real sense of this is where my gifts are, with some confidence, with a sense of calling, it probably means we can do that thing more wholeheartedly and in that way almost build relationships with people naturally. And we almost become a little bit of a light in these places, in these dark places, especially if we're embodying some of the values of the kingdom there. And then in that space, we build relationships, and into those relationships, we then have an opportunity to introduce them to Jesus. But that feels such a natural thing to do. It's just, why wouldn't you do that? And maybe that's what evangelism looks at in our modern cultural context. That's what evangelism should be.
I think that's a really wise thought. And I think that fits so much more with what God's mission is.
Yeah.
And we are part of that.
We've got some discussion questions, I think, that are going to come up on the screen in a few moments. do pause the video, obviously, so you can discuss the questions. If you want to take the next step in your vocational journey, do chat with your church leadership. The Foundations of Ministry course at the Diocese of Guildford is a great and practical way to take a sort of very intentional step in that direction, on that journey. You can find more by scanning the QR code on the screen, should be on the screen, or heading to the Diocese of Guildford website. Philip and I will be praying for you as you head on into your discussion groups, but also on your journey ahead. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you, Philip.